Welcome to Boss Talk. My name is Jim Parker. This is my business partner, Carey Sobel.
Thank you for joining us today. Today's episode is Why Do Deals Die? Now, we have another business partner, and his name's Tony, and Tony tells me that a deal is never dead. And I can honestly say he is one of the best brokers that I've ever worked with that is damn good at resuscitating deals.
Tony thinks outside the box.
He really does.
He's a good outside the box thinker.
But he's wrong, because deals do die.
Yeah.
Now, what I will say is it was a tactic when I was being trained that you have to put in all of the persistence that you possibly can to prevent a deal from dying. There's always a reason or an opportunity to try to revive a deal. In fact, today, right before we started the session, I had a deal that was about to die that looks like it's going to come back alive again.
Well, you know what they say. Deals die many times before they close.
Exactly.
And that's kind of like the saying in our industry.
Yeah. Well, and my wife gets furious with me because I'm always like, oh, this deal's dead. She goes, you said that before, and then you closed the business. So, but the fact of the matter is, it's very hard to hold a deal together. There's so many steps in the business sale and transaction process. So much margin for error. So many opportunities for a deal to fall off the tracks. Emotions are a part of it, and we're going to discuss so many of the reasons of why deals die today. We're going to talk about methods that we could use to try to prevent deals from dying. Let's kick off, Jim. What do you think is the number one reason why deals die?
I would say the number one reason why deals die is because things weren't prepared properly up front. I look at it as preparation before you go to the market is critical. And look, you could prep and you could do all that work as much as you possibly can, and you're still going to run into situations down the road. I mean, you can't. But it's I keep telling you this, Carey. It's like playing chess. I play chess. I don't play chess anymore, but I'm not very good.
Me neither.
If me and you were playing chess, I'd wait every time for you to make a move before I would decide what my move is. And I use this analogy all the time, but it's a great analogy. Whereas a good chess player, they're thinking many, many, many steps ahead. They know all those moves. Now, I might not be a good chess player, but I think I'm pretty good at what we do. And what we do, that's what we need to do, is we need to think many steps ahead. We got to look at what you call like SWOT analysis. We've got to look at obstacles that we're going to be facing. We're going to be looking at things that the skeletons in the closet on the business. We got to pull those out early. We'll get into all these details, but the concept is the more prep that we can work with the seller up front before the business even goes to the market, and we can get an idea of what types of buyers are going to be most likely inquiring about this, what are going to be their hot buttons, and what are going to be their concerns, and how are we going to handle this situation, from landlords to SBA lenders to attorneys all the way through. We need to have kind of like how we're going to handle the different situations.
And in previous episodes, we talked about the wave theory. And we talked about sellers sometimes getting frustrated where in the beginning of a listing, how much time we take to bring something to market because we're doing it properly. Ultimately, what we're doing is saving time for them on the back end. And you mentioned skeletons in the closet. When we're looking at a business to list and bring to market, we are trying to find everything wrong with that business that we possibly can. And we are trying to disclose that information up front. But, part of the process of going through selling a business is there's a due diligence process. And the due diligence process is what stops going under contract to getting a deal closed. So it's everything that is in the middle of that due diligence process that is used to try to prevent a deal from falling apart, or for the buyer to say, nope, this isn't for me. What do you see during the due diligence process as more often than not where a deal falls off the tracks? Is it financial related?
Yeah, I'd say it's financial related. That's probably the number one concern. That's where the focus is when a buyer's, because we go under contract, we enter into that due diligence process. The buyer is going to ask for certain financial information from the business owner. And what they're trying to do in that due diligence process is to prove what has been claimed up to that point. Right. Are they really doing the revenues that they're doing? Are they really doing the discretionary earnings or the net profit of the business? Is it really living up to what was claimed in the financial aspect? And it goes beyond just, hey, here's my tax returns, here's my profit and loss statements, here's my balance sheets. They're asking for a host of other financial information. Merchant services, bank accounts, anything financial related for that particular business. The buyer's going to want to look at to see if they can really match up between that. And that's why it's critical that, when we are taking a business to the market, that when we're doing those add backs, and we did an earlier episode about this, last week, where we do add backs. We're adding things back to the discretionary earnings line. We have to be conservative when we're coming up with those numbers. If they cannot be proved in the due diligence process, we should not be adding it back. We shouldn't be saying, hey, this was not an expense necessary for the business. If that can't be proved, we shouldn't be making that statement to a buyer.
No doubt. And, beyond validating the financials that were put in a SIM or put in a marketing package.
Which we don't do, by the way. We're not validating them.
No.
Yeah.
It would be the valuation, right? Because a lot of times the business owner will put their front foot forward and they put their financials out there, and maybe you go under contract. A lot of times you see somebody then trying to short a seller, right? They try to wrap a deal up, lock it up, negotiate, and get the sale price down. Typically we try to avoid that before going under contract, but more times than not, I see a lot of negotiation happening afterwards, not just because of the financial things that they've uncovered, but maybe there's a customer concentration issue that they didn't know about, or maybe the owner didn't truthfully talk about how much participation they have in the business. Maybe it's a lot, and the buyer doesn't really want to spend that much time in the business. So you see some renegotiation happening quite a bit on the value after you go under contract.
Carey, I'm going to say this. I have my birthday coming up. I don't know if you know that. Don't spend more than $1,000 for me, though.
What's the date, just so I know?
Well, it's coming up. But anyways, I love surprises.
Yeah.
But not when it comes to what we do.
No.
There should be no surprises in that due diligence process. We go under contract. Everything should already be out on the table, and they should be aware of that. And when we go into that due diligence process, we do not want buyers discovering things at that point in time.
Especially that we don't know.
That we don't know. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That due diligence should be more about, that the buyers seeing for themselves that the business is really doing and performing what the seller has claimed the business is doing. It's not the time for them to find surprises.
So something that's maybe not a surprise that was controlled, but you're in due diligence, you're under contract, we're not combating at this point the value of the business, the financial information that was previously provided seems to match up. Now there's a huge decrease in sales during that period of time, or there's a huge increase in price during that time. What happens?
Oh, once it goes under contract and you see something that, that could, if you see a big decrease once it goes under contract, it's going to concern a buyer.
Yeah.
We talk about it all the time. One of the biggest things that a buyer is looking at is risk.
Yep.
And if all of a sudden the business is starting to take a downturn once it goes under contract, it's a risk factor to the buyer. And the buyer might back. They're going to do one of three things. They're going to either be okay with it and move forward. Maybe there's a reasonable explanation of why that happened, or they could back out of the contract, or they might renegotiate that contract at that point.
And you have the opportunity always to get a deal back on track. If something like that happened and there's a spike or a dip, and it's something that looks like it could be sustaining beyond, an anomaly, you have the opportunity to renegotiate and get buyer and seller together. But one of the things that I think gets a deal off track right away is when buyer and seller don't like each other.
Oh, no.
And this is a huge topic, but you can usually recover a deal if you get some trust and integrity built between the buyer and the seller. Right. I personally believe that the only thing that gets a deal to a closing table is if there is some integrity built up between the buyer and the seller. The buyer and the seller like each other, they trust each other, they're usually able to overcome most obstacles.
I like that. I like that you're bringing up the trust factor, Carey. I'm really glad you did, because my feeling and the likability, I always say that to make a deal go through, and I want to have this before we even go under contract, I want the buyer and the seller to like each other and to trust each other. If they don't like each other and they don't trust each other, chances are we're not going to get it to the closing table. And if we do get it to the closing table, there's going to be a lot of problems. And at the end of the day, for you buyers out there, a business owner that owns that business, that's their baby. And I know that you hear that all the time, but they gave birth to that business, literally gave birth, got a corporation set up, worked their butt off. They raised it. They, the baby's now mature and they're ready to, for that baby to leave and go on its own. And they want, most sellers that I work with, a really important thing to them is that they want to like the buyer. They want to make sure that buyer is going to carry on the good name of the business. And I hear a lot of business owners saying, in 10 years from now, I want to see that business not just still being there, but I want to see it really prospering. And that likability is really important. I want to stay on this topic for a few more minutes.
Yeah, let's do. Well, there's an emotional attachment, like you talked about, of a business owner who either bought a business and ran it forever, or in most cases they've started the business and ran it for a period of time. So their emotional attachment to the business is a little bit fragile, right? Selling a business is an emotional process, and the seller needs to be respected. And typically, if the buyer wants to get a deal done, they're going to respect the buyer to try to buy their business. But the communication between the buyer and the seller, which we try to facilitate fluidly the whole time, we encourage communication. We're not trying to keep buyer and seller separate for the chances that a deal could fall apart. The more that they can get together, the better chances that the deal's going to get done. The more communication that they have, the better chances that it's going to get done, and gives them the chance to build rapport and see if they actually like each other. And in a lot of deals, the seller has to stay on post-closing.
Yep.
So if the buyer and the seller don't like each other, and they're not going to want to work with each other.
Right. And that's a big thing is to the buyer before they put an offer on the business. Most of the time, almost all the time, the buyer really likes the seller and trusts the seller. And obviously they like the business, and that's why they're buying the business. But I don't know if I've done a deal where buyers told me, I really like the business, and I don't like the seller, but I still want to move forward.
Yeah.
It just doesn't happen because, the buyer's going to do all that due diligence, but at the end of the day, they are going to still take a little bit of faith and leap of faith, and they got to trust that seller for that. And like you said, post closing, they're going to count on that seller to help for the transition period, and help them train the buyer and get them up to speed and make that transition from the seller to the buyer. It's really critical. And if the buyer doesn't like and trust the seller,
it's not getting done.
It's really, really important.
I think another part of this relative to buyer and seller relationship is a cultural alignment or a cultural misalignment. And I know there's a particular example that you had brought up previously that we might touch on, but that won't always kill a deal. So a perfect example of that is I had a buyer-seller meeting last night, and the seller said, there's one thing that I want to make sure that you guarantee me if you move forward with this transaction is that you treat my staff with respect and treat them well.
I love that.
Which was
Carey.
awesome.
I love when I hear things like that from a seller. I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. And it's genuine, and it has to be genuine.
And the buyer felt it was genuine, and it was a point in, yes, I want to buy this business because of how he treats his employees, but he ultimately then said, how you decide you want to handle bonuses and how you want to do paid time off and how you want to do holidays and all of the different things that are maybe perks, or your management style and how you walk the floor to manage the team, that's all up to you. So culturally, how you engage with them is up to you, but so long as you treat them with respect, that's all I can ask.
I'm going to take on a side note, and I know we're getting off topic real quick, but I've seen a lot of different businesses over the years. I mean, I've been selling businesses for almost 25 years. I can say that usually the more successful businesses, they take care of their employees.
Yep.
They take care of their vendors. They take care of the people that help get the business done. And the businesses that struggle, they don't treat their employees as well, both from a pay or a compensation standpoint, as well as how they treat them personality-wise, and they beat up on their vendors too much. Where the vendors, they don't have their back when push comes to shove. And you take care of your vendors, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, this just came in, I need this, and you're taking care of them. They're going to bend over backwards for you to get it done.
And those points that you're bringing up, you can't uncover in a confidential information memorandum or in one meeting, right? So
that's the culture you're talking about.
Right. And deals may die because you didn't see that negative side of it, that they beat up their vendors, they don't treat their staff. But maybe in one scenario in a deal, the seller allows the buyer to come in and start engaging with some of the employees, and they're like, I hate this guy, I hate working for this guy. Well, those are going to be red flags. That could be a reason why they could look at it as an opportunity, because now they could come in, they could treat the employees better, or they look at it like these people are not treated well, and it's going to be hard to recover that.
A lot of times, Carey, and you know this, a lot of times what happens when you go under contract in our industry, and I say our industry is business intermediaries, and I'm not talking M&A transactions, by the way. I'm talking upper Main Street deals that I do, or Main Street deals. you come into a transaction, and it's very common in our industry that the intermediaries want to keep the buyer and the seller completely away from each other once it goes under contract. And the thought processes behind that is that, they can get fatigued with each other, or, they could try to be negotiating things that aren't good. I mean, there's a lot of different reasons. I don't want to get into that. But the idea is to keep them away as much as you possibly can. And what Carey and I do is we encourage that engagement, where once we go under contract, every 2 weeks or thereabouts, we have a call between the buyer, the seller, me if it's my transaction, Carey if it's his transaction, and our closing coordinator. And we jump on that call, and it'll usually last about an hour. And, the seller will give a rundown on anything that news going on with the business. This happened or that happened. I brought on a new account. I lost that account. Blah, 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 blah. And the buyer gives an update on what's going on with their process. Oh, this is what's going on with the lender. This is what's going on with this. Or I have more questions. Can they ask some questions? But that engagement, and what we're trying to do at my office too, is at our office, is that we're communicating between all the parties. But sometimes it's the buyer and the seller already know what's going on, but hearing it directly from each other goes a long way.
Yep.
And what we find with this approach, and it's a controlled situation, because what we don't want to have is a buyer calling the seller 5 times a day or communicating. So we control it. We set up the call. Everybody gets on there. And like I said, it's an hour. Maybe, at some point it drops to 10 or 15 minutes when everything's in the lender's hands and we're just kind of waiting for the lender. And then a couple weeks before closing, it might turn into an every week call, because we're talking about how we're going to transition that business from the seller to the buyer. But that communication between the buyer and the seller is critical, because they can hear things from each other. And usually, going back to the like and trust, they like and trust each other before they go under contract. And they continue building that likability and that trustworthy between each other. And then when you do have a hiccup, whether it's on the buyer side or the seller side, the buyer and the seller are more likely to work together because they've been communicating. When you go under contract and the buyer and the seller don't talk for such a long period of time,
finger pointing. It's not problem solving.
They start to lose that personal connection, and they start just looking at each other as the seller or the buyer and not the personality, and it makes the whole transaction go, a little bit harder. And then when there is a problem, it is not that communication. The communication's key.
Absolutely.
That's a big part of Boss Group is communication. Yep. Whether it's communication between us, it's communication between, us and our seller, between our us and our buyers, between the seller and the buyer. Communication is a key process.
We like to work with people that we like, and we like to think that people like working with us because they like us. So, if buyer and seller like each other, the deal's probably going to get done. If they don't, the deal's going to die.
Well, Carey, it's so true. This is a long process. There's a lot of things that we need to do when we're talking to a seller. We might be engaged with them for many, many months, and we're going to be, it's a big transaction. It's usually the biggest transaction of the seller's life. And if they don't care for me and my personality, I would rather them go with somebody else that they really would feel more comfortable working with. And on the flip side of that, I look at it, I've turned down business listings, opportunities to take business to the market where the business is a really good business, but I didn't like or trust the seller. And to me, I don't want to get involved with a transaction where, especially the trust factor, where I get involved in a transaction where I don't trust the seller. And if I don't trust the seller, the buyer's not going to trust the seller. But more importantly, I don't want to be involved in a transaction that, maybe the seller's not giving the whole truth, and whatever it is, I don't know what it is. And from a likability standpoint, I have to be engaged with this person for many months. And I don't want to be like, every time I call them, be like, I don't want to call this person. You know what I mean? I want to call them and go, hey, Joe, it's Jim. Hey, Jim, how you doing? And we have a good working relationship.
I really enjoy building the relationships with the seller. It also makes the sellers more solution-oriented, right? Because we touched on this being an emotional process, and there's so many times throughout a sale process where hiccups come up or issues come up. And you have to it's very rare that we list a business for sale and get to the end without some big red flags or phone calls, and you want to be working with somebody that has a problem-solving attitude so that a deal doesn't die, so that they're motivated to try to fix things. And moving on to maybe some of the operational reasons why deals fall apart, maybe less about buyer and seller, but maybe structures and contracts. Let's talk about contracts. Contracts in the form of leases, contracts in the form of vendors or suppliers, or contracts with maybe clients or customers, expiring contracts, right? So you get to the due diligence period and you find out that your supplier is going out of business, or that your lease is up, and maybe you have to go negotiate a new lease. Let's talk about leases for a moment. Landlords. I cannot tell you how many deals I have had killed from landlords.
Yep, landlords are a tough one.
Yeah. And a lot of times it's just because they don't want to deal with it, or they have somebody locked up for a period of time and they don't care to entertain a new buyer.
Especially if that lease, the business is dependent on that lease. Let's take, I don't sell very many restaurants anymore. I've sold a ton in the past, but let's take a restaurant. They're dependent on that lease. And if you can't get that lease either assigned or a new lease to that buyer coming in, you have nothing to sell.
Nothing.
And that landlord is holding all the cards at that point. And, so that's why, you don't want anybody to know that your business is for sale. You don't want your employees to know, customers to know, vendors, competitors. But when it comes to your lease, and if the business is dependent on the lease, we should be having conversations with your landlord up front. What are you looking for, Mr. or Mrs. Landlord, from a new tenant? What kind of credit score are you looking at? What kind of net worth? What kind of experience? That way, when we're vetting buyers for your business, we know what the landlord's looking for. And if those buyers do not have that, then we don't even have to disclose to those buyers the name of the business or anything like that. And by the way, it's all done confidential. If we do give something to somebody, they sign a confidentiality agreement. Big thing here is we don't want anybody to know the business is for sale. But having those communications with a landlord up front before you go to the market could save a lot of time in the back down the road. Instead of meeting with a buyer a couple of times and negotiating a contract and start the due diligence process, and then you're 3/4 of the way through the due diligence process, and you try to get the lease assigned, and the landlord's like, I don't think this person has the experience, or I don't think they have the net worth that makes me comfortable, blah, 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 blah. You got to have those conversations up front.
And even worse, you could go through the process, and if you don't figure it out pre-listing and you do all of that work, landlord could say, yeah, we never really had any intentions to give any extra term on this. We were just going to let the lease expire.
Yeah, and we're going to take it over ourselves.
I've actually done that once. I worked with a seller for almost a year to sell his business, and the last step was, Mr. Landlord, here's the prospect tenant. And they go, we're not going to renew your lease. Yeah. Well, I just wasted a year of my time.
So it's good to have those communications with the landlord up front. And talking about contracts, it's not just the landlords, but if it's a franchise business,
franchise
what you're going to need the franchise approval. So you should be having those communications if you can with the franchise. And I know sometimes there's a tricky situation there. This is all tricky. So it's best to talk to a seasoned, experienced business broker about this type of stuff. But if you got a good relationship with the franchisor, and it would be great to have those conversations with the franchisor about how they're gonna qualify, or allow a buyer to take over. So any kind of contracts like that are dependent, we have to deal with up front, or we should be dealing up front.
And they're usually in the due diligence period. There are contingencies that have to be met in order for that due diligence period to be successful. And the contingencies give the buyer an opportunity to pull out of the contract, get their escrow money returned if the contingencies are not met. Some of those contingencies are financial contingencies, which we spoke about. They could be a lease contingency with the landlord, that the landlord is going to approve an incoming buyer or approve the buyer to buy the business and successfully get the lease assigned. As Jim just mentioned, a franchise approval. If you're buying a franchise, the franchise has to say grace in order for you to become a franchisee. We also have visa requirements if somebody's looking to get an E2 visa
or an L1 visa.
Yep. All of these contingencies are typically financing contingencies, right? That's a big one.
Yep.
These are all put into a purchase contract as the main items that need to happen to successfully get through a due diligence period and get to a closing table. And the deals typically die, if they die, because one of those contingencies are not met.
Exactly. And that's why when you're taking all these things that Carey just mentioned, do you want to be in a situation where you go through the process of trying to sell your business, and you finally get under contract, and there's a lot of time that you put into it, a lot of time everybody put into it, and then you're hoping and praying that these items that Carey talked about are going to be okay? Or would you rather handle that stuff up front before we even go to the market, so we know what we're looking at? We know going in, hey, we should be okay. The landlord's going to love this buyer. They got the credit score. They got the net worth, blah, blah, blah. They got the experience, da, da, da. Or the franchisor is going to love it. And then you're not as concerned, and you're not hoping and praying that these contingencies are going to kill the deal. And that's the big thing, is just looking ahead and saying, what are the things, or what are the types of people that are going to be the obstacles, and what are they looking for, or what are those things going to be? So
another one that comes up pretty often of why deals get thrown off, I don't think it actually kills deals all the time, but it's definitely an issue, is employee turnover, and especially if the employee turnover or a key employee leaves when they find out that the business is for sale, or shortly after a business is sold, somebody leaves. It's always a concern, right? So an example to combat that is, there's a key employee in a business I'm selling right now, and that key employee went to the owner of the business and said, I'm looking to retire. I think he was like 71 years old. And then the business owner came back and told this potential retiree, well, I'm actually going to list my business for sale then, because I'd like to retire too. And now that you told me this, we can do it together. Would you mind giving me 6 months of your time after I sell the business to help facilitate the transition? So they had that conversation up front. Seller said, it's the time for me too. The general manager had requested to retire, and they got a game plan together. So now, as they're going through the due diligence process, they're both engaging with the buyer. The buyer already knows that that key employee is going to retire, and together as a group, they're looking for their replacements collectively.
And that's a fantastic situation.
Doesn't always happen like that.
Doesn't always happen like that, because a lot of times, but that's a good way. In that particular instance, the seller talked to the manager prior to probably even engaging you.
He did.
Saying that, hey, I'm thinking about selling too, and da-da-da-da.
What was the catalyst for him to come talk to
So
me?
it worked. But many times, the business owner doesn't want to tell a key employee or key employees that they're selling the business.
Most cases, they don't want to tell.
Most cases, they don't. And I don't think a seller should.
No.
In most cases.
Neither
And
do
that's
I.
a unique case. Most cases, they should not. You shouldn't let anybody know the business is for sale. But on the flip side of that, going back to risk, we're always talking about risk. Going on the flip side of that, the buyer is going to have that concern. About if that key employer, those key employees, leave the business once I acquire the business. Look, employees are usually worried when they find out a business is for sale, and this is why you don't want to tell employees that you're selling your business, because they get worried. Oh, the person that comes along, are they going to replace me? And they have rent or mortgage, they got card payments, they got their living expenses. And they're like, business is for sale. Am I going to lose my job? And they go look for another job. And so they're concerned. So the buyers have this concern, the employees have this concern, and we don't want the buyers meeting with the key employees. So depending on how key those employees are to the business, there are strategies that we can do that will be beneficial to the employee, and it would be reduce the risk factor from the buyer's perspective. Mm-hmm. And those are things that we can talk about. We get on the phone with you if you're thinking about selling your business. You have key employees. Talk to us about those key employees. Don't downplay that you don't have key employees, and then we find out in due diligence that you do have key employees. Those are conversations we have to have up front, and then we can strategize together. Carey and I have been selling businesses for a long time. There's things that we can do to reduce the risk on the seller's, on the buyer's part, and the employee's going to be okay.
Another thing that causes deals to fall apart, which is uncontrollable, are outside factors, external factors, political factors, social, economic factors. The closest one that we can put our finger on is probably COVID-19. I luckily had quite a few deals that ended up closing that were either reduced for a reason or another during the COVID pandemic, but it definitely took a lot of deals off track. And the pandemic created a somewhat of a recession, right? And financial institutions froze up, so deals that we had that were under contract with financial assistance coming through never came through. Right, and that wasn't because of the buyer, that wasn't because of the seller, that was because of a factor beyond their control. Another one, maybe, as I mentioned, lawsuits. An open lawsuit can cause an issue. You talked about mitigating risk. One of the parts of a closing that prevents risk or indemnifies is the indemnification agreement. Indemnification agreement is where the buyer says that anything from the day forward of the day of closing, I will assume responsibility for. And the seller says everything that happened prior to the closing, the seller will assume responsibility for. So there's ways to combat uncontrollables that pop up, like lawsuits or anything happening environmentally. But those are the ones that pop up out of nowhere that, kind of really are the most shocking, right? Political issues. Could the political environment during election years could be something that could cause some turbulence, and changes in the ability to do sales.
Political, real quick. The contract didn't fall apart, but I saw a situation where it was another broker's listing, and I was working with the buyers, and we had talked to the sellers over the phone, and then we set up an in-person meeting and went in there outside of business hours and walked in, and the seller had support for a certain president all over the office, and the buyers had the opposite viewpoint. I mean, in a situation like that, I almost kind of feel like it was probably better, because it was like they were way different, and I think that would have,
So another thing that we had talked about was buyer-seller fatigue. And I think the buyer-seller fatigue can happen from, obviously a personality issue, but what about negotiations? A lot of times you get under contract and you start uncovering things, and then buyer wants more and seller wants more. They might be greedy, and they could just get fatigued from not only dealing with each other, but just the process of buying a business and selling a business is arduous.
Yeah. And like you said, even in the negotiation process, the more times that goes back between the buyer and the seller in the negotiation process can cause that ill will, and both parties don't want the other person to have that ill will.
No.
You want to go, because this isn't like, at the end of the day, it's not like you're going down and you're buying a car off the used in a used car lot, and you're driving it off and you're done with the transaction. We're selling businesses. You go under contract. The buyer and the seller both have to feel good about what the contract is for them. Because if they don't, we've got too much time, usually 60, 90 days before we close. If one of the parties feels like they didn't get a very good end of the stick in the negotiations, very hard to get at the closing table. Both parties got to feel good when we go under contract.
And another thing we usually talk about that could cause some controversy, I guess, or negotiation opportunity is the familiarization period. You talked about a person running their business for a long period of time. Deep knowledge rests with that seller.
Yep.
And the buyer is saying, okay, when I take this over, am I really going to be able to do this myself? Mr. Seller, how long are you willing to stay on for? Well, I'm retiring, so I'll give you a couple months and I want out. That right there, that familiarization period, and how long will Mr. Seller commit contractually to the business? Not saying, yeah, I'll answer my phone when you call and answer your questions.
Yeah.
That is has become even more so recently for some of the deals I've done, a reason why deals tend to get off track. Never die, but get off track.
Yeah. I mean, you take, again, I don't do this anymore, but you take an ice cream store, you only need 2 weeks of training. You take a much more difficult type of a business, the deals that we're working with, you need a lot more training period. And so kind of the standard, and I don't want to say standard, everything's negotiable, but I guess what more of the norm is, the seller will offer to the buyer a 1 month training period at zero extra, no cost. That's included in the asking price. But the buyer will a lot of times need more than 1 month. So over that 1 month that's included with the purchase price of the business, there might be a 6 month or a 1 year or 3 month training period where the seller will get compensated. And they're going to listen, if you're a business owner and you sell your business to a buyer and then you get done with your 1 month training period, but you commit to another 6 months with the buyer to continue working at that business, you're not going to get compensated as if you still own the business. There's going to be more at like a fair market salary to get compensated at. But that makes it much more attractive to a buyer that you're willing to stay on for a little bit, so that it's a smoother, easier transition, and you will get compensated for it. And it should be a fair compensation.
Before we move into how to prevent deals from dying, is there anything else that you can think of, whether it's a story or another attribute of why deals die, why deals fall off the tracks? I mean, we've talked about financial, we've talked about employees, we've talked about what we both think is probably the most important, buyer and seller like each other. What's something else that you can think of?
I think there's a lot of things. I don't think that we could sit here right now, Carey, and you and I could come up with a lot of, like, all the reasons why a business is going to fall apart. I think the premise of this podcast today is to say that it is a situation that we have to be worried about. 50% of all deals, this is a national average. This isn't Carey and I's average. If this is me and Carey's average, we would, I don't know if we'd be in the industry. I think we would hang ourselves. But the national average is that 50% of the deals that go under contract, business sales go under contract, fall apart before they get to the closing table. You know, what you need to do, and the premise of this podcast is that we need to work together up front. And the more planning that we can do up front, the more skeletons that you have in the closet that you tell us about up front, the more obstacles that we can identify. They may not be a negative obstacle, but obstacles that we can identify up front, the more pre-planning that we can do, it greatly reduces the chances of the deal falling apart. The prep work up front is the most critical. It's kind of like Steve Covey's book, 10 Habits of Successful People. One of the stories in that book is, it's a story about a gentleman's in the woods and he's got an axe and he's chopping down trees, and but his axe is dull, and somebody comes along and goes, if you sharpen your axe, you'll be able to chop down the trees quicker. And he goes, I got so many trees to chop down, I just got to keep swinging. But if he took that time out and he sharpened that saw, the process would go a lot smoother and he'd get done a lot quicker. It's the same thing. Let's put the work in up front, and it's going to save you a lot of time down the road. You're going to maximize your sales price of the business, and you're also going to greatly increase the chances of getting your business sold. I'm a firm believer in that. I mean, I probably get one or two businesses a year that were listed with another broker that they never sold, and I take it on and I get it sold. And there's many reasons for that, but a large part of that is the prep work before you go to the market.
No question about it. Measure 3 times, cut once.
Yeah.
And then being honest. So it's the skeletons in the closet, the red flags will come out.
Yeah.
When your business is listed for sale, there will be a magnifying glass on it, and every single blemish will come out, more than likely. So call it out at the beginning. We are an advocate for the business owner that we list their business to help them accomplish what they hire us to do. If you tell us everything that is going on with your business, good and bad, from the beginning, we will do a better job selling your business. No question about it. And I guarantee you that we will save you time. I can't guarantee that I'll save your business. I can guarantee if you follow the way that we do this, we can save you time.
And if you're a business owner out there that is thinking about selling their business and wants to hide those situations, those skeletons in the closet, don't give me a call. And I don't mean to say that in a mean way, but I just don't. I only want to be working with good, honest, trustworthy people. And they're going to come, and it's because it's going to come out in due diligence, but I don't want to be working with somebody like that at all. Yeah. And you know what? If you're that type of person and you do sell your business and it's not found in due diligence, and chances are it will be found in due diligence. But if it's not, you're going to be looking at lawsuits. And thank goodness I've never seen that happen with any of the businesses that I've sold, a lawsuit because a seller being but
if not lawsuits, it'll be karma.
Yeah, it'll be karma.
Yeah. But I think it's important to understand the motivations of both the seller and the buyer. And if those motivations aren't honest, why are you actually trying to sell your business? Why are you actually trying to buy your business? Understanding those motivations is huge. And from the motivation, setting proper expectations on both sides.
You're absolutely right, Carey. And I'm not just putting this weight on the seller when we talk about being honest. It's the buyer too.
Oh yeah.
If you're a buyer and you're looking to acquire a business, the more honest you are as well. I mean, everybody's just got to be honest and work together. Mm-hmm. To get things done.
People say business is about leverage and getting one over on each other. When you're trying to transact, it is about creating unity.
Yes.
It is about creating a favorable situation for buyer and seller. And I think the best situations are when seller is saying, hey, I want to retire. I don't have somebody to leave my business to. I'm prideful of my business. I ran it for X amount of period in time. I want somebody to come on and carry on my legacy. They're proud and prideful of what they have. And the buyers usually coming in, if they have, good motivations and you create that unity, they're carrying the baton of something that somebody did. In what we do professionally, there's no better feeling than seeing a person who worked in this business for 30, 40 years selling it to a buyer, and the buyer goes, I'm going to carry this torch forward. I love seeing that.
Yeah.
It's great.
And everybody being happy at the end of the day. I mean, it's got to be a win-win situation for both parties.
So one of the main ways to avoid deals falling apart is creating good rapport between buyer and seller, establishing frequent communication, honest communication, pulling out the red flags day one.
Seller being upfront with us, and seller allowing us to ask a million questions up front. The buyer being honest with us and telling us everything about their situation.
Well, on that point, we talked about buyer qualification, right? Something that we take a lot of pride in is a seller lists their business with us. Our goal is to try to gatekeep the tire kickers from talking to the seller and wasting their time. Or
even find out which business it is that's
right.
for sale.
Absolutely. So we qualify the buyers or interested parties, pre-screen them as much as we possibly can for, do they have the adequate financial capacity to acquire a business? Do they have the experience to buy it? Do they have the means to buy it? So we try to do everything we can up front to avoid a deal falling apart by making sure that we're working with quality people, both from a financial standpoint and just good people in general, in nature.
And one of the things going to the buyer's end, we were talking about a lot about the sellers. We do have the lending situation. Where is the buyer going to get approved for that loan? And that if it's going to be an SBA loan, and I never fully count everything until we close, and the paperwork's signed and the money's been transferred. But
until the money hits my account, the deal's not done.
But that's something that we shouldn't be hoping, praying for either. That buyer should be talking to a lender. If they need an SBA loan, they should be talking to that lender before they put an offer in. And they should definitely be talking to the lender prior to the seller accepting any kind of an offer. To see, because the lenders are going to look through and they're going to say, yeah, this looks like a person. It doesn't look like a person. We work with great lenders that I think, like a couple of them, they 95% of those deals go through once the lender looks at the initial stuff and says, yeah, this person looks good. But that communication with the lender is important. So it's not just what the seller's doing and not doing on their end, but there's a lot on the buyer's end that we have to deal with to deal with as well. But today I think we're talking more about sellers and what they can expect.
Yeah, and ultimately, talking on the topic of why do deals die, thousands of reasons why deals die, and there's thousands of strategies to combat every single one of them. We haven't seen them all, Jim, but we've seen a lot of them. And each time I think that we close a deal, we learn something new, and it gives us an opportunity to be more equipped for the people that we list their
more
business
tools
for.
in our toolbox.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I will never aspire to have a shortage of tools. I'll always want more. Every deal is an opportunity to learn, to meet new people, and come up with new strategies to keep closing deals.
And whether you're going to list with Carey or myself or another business broker out there, you just got to make sure you're with somebody that is taking the time out up front. So that's going to take the time out up front and be pretty thorough with everything, so that they can strategize and they can look at those obstacles, they can look at those things, those skeletons, so we can potentially get the deal done. If you don't, I just hope you're not part of that 50% casualty rate, because that's a horrible
statistic.
That's a horrible statistic. I don't want to be a part of that statistic.
Yep.
So.
Well, thank you for tuning in today to this episode of Boss Talk. My name is Carey Sobel with my partner, Jim Parker.
I really appreciate you joining in. Thank you.